Hello everyone, so here I am doing Season 3 prep and realizing it's been more than a month since we got Cutting Edge and I haven't done my seasonally rant about Aberrus. So without further ado, let's do that because it's always fun to look back and, I don't know, see opinions about how these bosses was for us. So let's start with the very first one, and that's Kazzara. Now, Kazzara is this great first boss. It's your dragon boss. You start a raid and there's like these rifts that you need to place in certain spots, and then you have lasers following people around, and then you can't even actually overlap the lasers or overlap the drawing they leave on the floor, or that's going to cause you a wipe. So it is mechanically somewhat challenging, but the real challenging part becomes how these mechanics escalate further into the fight and then becoming a very chaotic end part of the fight, making that for a first boss, this boss is a bit hard in my opinion, because at the end of the fight it gets very chaotic. Also the tuning is somewhat hard, or it was somewhat hard, and in reality, what happened is if you killed Kazzara first boss, then you kill Amalgamation and Zaqali, no problem, and then you're left with a Vault. So a first boss dictating whether you can get Vault or not is probably not the best option, but the boss is still like phenomenal, and for that reason, I am giving Kazzara an A to start off this tier list. Moving on to Amalgamation Chamber. Now this is a great boss that you have to split a raid into two, and then you have this shadow side and then this fire side, and each one has their own mechanics. Some is spread, some is soak, another mass soaks, individual soaks, and then like just spread away. But you also have these debuffs that you can't touch each other, and you have to smartly put people in the middle to like cleave both and whatnot. Just to make this fight a bit easier and shorter. But the cool thing is, once you get to 50%, or at least one of those mini bosses get to 50%, what's gonna happen is that both bosses will merge and making the average of both bosses elf together. And then you have to deal with this mega boss, or like the fusion of these two bosses, which has its own set of mechanics. Now the way that these mechanics work is they work in parity, which means that you get mechanic A and B, and then C and D, and then whatever, right? You get pairs of mechanics, and you don't have one mechanic alone every single time. So that is a very cool thing about this boss. Now, what I would have loved here instead, by the way, the tuning was great. It was not too hard, but also not too easy. And what was lacking, in my opinion, was that those overlaps in phase 2 that you get, they're always the same in the same order. And I think I would have loved to see a bit more variety just to make this boss slightly harder. But for a second boss and all that things, I think this is a great boss and giving me another A on this tier list. Now, if there's any ICC fans out there from Wrath of the Lich King, you know that there's this third boss called Gunship Battle, and everyone knows that by Loot Ship Battle, because it's honestly a free fight. And Zaqali is exactly that. You have this boss where you have to split the raid, but if you have good assignments and you split the raid into two even groups, you kill the odds and whatnot, push the boss, get your timings right, and then just group up and, you know, spread, use a cooldown, and then soak the door. I mean, it's nothing fancy. There's like a lot of mechanics and a lot of interactions, but they're probably not tuned correctly, so they're just too easy. And then the boss itself ends up being a boss that you can just two-shot it or three-shot it like we did, and yeah, it's just so easy. And for a third boss, I'll expect a bit more toughness from this boss, and for that reason, sadly, I can't give this boss more than a C tier. Now, we're on to the fourth boss, and this is where things start to get real. Especially on Mythic, you start to feel like, oh man, this is where it gets real. You have this boss that they come, and the Mythic mechanic, one of them at least, is like another boss comes when one boss is 50%, so now you have to deal with that. But honestly, what happens here, between all the mechanics, like all the mechanics are pretty cool. The Mass Dispel one that you have to deal with debuffs, and the boss flying away, the TAs as well, they're all pretty cool and stuff. But my problem with this boss is that firstly, you have to bring a certain comp that just has immunities or cauterizes from evokers or whatever to deal with the rending charges. And then you have a very shitty tank mechanic, honestly. No one likes that tank mechanic. And then finally, you have spell queue problems with the first boss, which means that you can't really push the first boss anytime. So you have to do it on a certain time, so you don't get a bad spell queue and therefore get yet another extra essence charge, right? And this really fucking sucks, right? It's really bad, poor design. So that all together with the boss just having like actual problems with the spell queue, and in my opinion it had potential. Something I would have loved to see is these canisters on the side like of the room. I would have loved for raiders to be able to interact with them. So let's say the left canister, because the second boss comes from the left and the third boss comes from the right. Let's say the second canister, when you get like too many debuffs, debuff players can go interact with that canister, and now that converts their debuff, so it removes the debuff completely, and it will put a TA, an extra TA for the rest of the fight. Now let's say that your guild struggles with TAs, now you'll interact with the right canister and then convert one of the TAs, eliminate it permanently from the fight, but in consequence you get an extra debuff. I would have loved to see some interaction like that, so you can actually manage certain mechanics a bit more than you can at the moment, because let's just be frank, let's say you have one priest and one priest only, so you can't really like be spamming mass dispel, then you'll probably just want a bunch more of TAs. But that being said, and with all the problems of this boss and actually lacking some potential, I sadly can't give this boss any higher than, at the most, a B. Okay, so this is where we took a massive leap in difficulty in the raid. We get to Rashok, and Rashok is this great boss. It has this leap mechanic, you have to choose one of two locations from the orbs, you can actually kinda bait them. Then you have to deal with like a bunch of lava waves, frontals, have a big soak, deal with your debuffs, so many swirlies, an intermission phase that is really heavy to heal, and then every leap is getting harder and harder at the end of the fight. And honestly, you're just gonna die if you don't have a very good plan with defensives and whatnot. But then at the same time, there's a DPS check on this boss that is somewhat tough. Now, here's the thing, if you play correctly, the DPS check is no problem. If no one dies, you won't reach like the Berserk timer, but we actually hit Berserk timer every single time because the fight is just so heavy to heal. So with this boss, I would have preferred to see Rashok having a 5% less HP, so that the fight becomes a bit more manageable when it comes to like losing players and then you can kill it. Or you just will reduce some of the damage at the end of the fight so that it just isn't as dangerous and you can actually meet the DPS check. We ended up bringing like more priests and having PIs and actually using augment runes to kill this boss the first time, but the reality is it's not really needed, or it wasn't really needed, but it just helped because we were losing a lot of players after the second intermission when things get real. So for its zone in the raid, I think this is a too hard boss, but in reality, if you were to put this boss like second to last or third to last, then it's actually arguably probably a little bit easier than you would expect, or maybe it's just spot on. I would have just preferred to be a bit more approachable, but that's just me nitpicking, because let's be honest, the boss design and the tuning is very, very good, and for that reason, even though it's not flawless and perfect, I still gotta say, man, this boss was real fun to progress and it was really challenging, it was a massive step up, and I love when that happens. So for that reason, this boss has to be my first S of the evening. So there are so many things that I hope that Blizzard never does ever again for any raid whatsoever, and the things that I don't want to happen is what happened with Zskarn. Let's look at the boss. You have these traps that spawn and you have the beams that shoot, you have these chaos. Pathing is really important, kind of like the Urna, and you have these bombs and you have to bait like the tactical distractions. That's all cool, but they fucked up and left safe zones in the room that you could just cheese the boss. And then, well, Hall of Fame was kind of fucked because of that, but when a lot of guilds got it the cheese way, other guilds were very frustrated, and with a lot of reason. And Blizzard decided to fix it. And now when they fix it, they actually did a boss rework and changed the way that you bait a tactical. Sure, they fixed the bug issue, or like the buggy issue that we could abuse, but they also reworked the boss in a bad way, where you no longer bait tactical destruction for the boss position, but for the average location of a player. And that just fucking sucks. But then you still have the boss super random, so shit, and I mean, they just fucked up so badly with this boss, and guess what? They make yet another rework, and now you have the boss, in my opinion, pretty okay. But the problem is, you ruined progression for a lot of guilds, and our guild was no exception. We really hated our experiences in here. This was mega painful, and we got quite tilted at this boss. Not to say that RNG is the reason we didn't kill it earlier, because honestly it's just, we could have played better. I'm a big believer that there's always skillful plays that you can do to counter RNG, but the reality is this boss was a nightmare for our guild and probably a lot more guilds, and I fucking hated it as well, not just our guildies. So I tell you what, this boss can't get any higher than an F. So Magmorax is actually a controversial boss where people think it's too easy, but in reality when you start doing the clears, you'll realize that this boss is actually not that easy, because this boss is one of the bosses that will wipe you the most on the clears for some reason, and I believe the reason is because of tuning. This is a very challenging boss tuning wise, and you have these like soak zones that you have to assign per player. You have to split your raid into two parts, soak in the middle and then split, and then you have teams that soak, and the good thing is you can actually choose who soaks what when, and because of that gives you a lot of control as the guild that is doing this, or the group that is doing this, the raid that's doing this. And as a raid leader, the best feeling in the world is having to do a boss that's hard, and when a player is having an issue because their class is squishy or whatever with that mechanic, you can actually, with the power of assignments, just, you know, fix that problem completely, and that feels really good. And that boss is insanely good for that reason. It's very challenging healing wise, DPS wise it's also challenging, not like insanely hard, but it's definitely when you start to get a bit challenged. And this boss is a great mechanic boss, great numbers boss, and if I'm being honest, I gotta just put this boss on S tier, probably not as good as Rashok, but it was very good, at least in my opinion. From the raid leader POV, it felt very good to do this boss. Probably could have had something else, some je ne sais quoi, you know, to make this boss a bit more challenging or just a bit more complete. But there's not much I will change from this boss, hence the S. So Echo of Neltharion is a boss that in PTR was getting some hate because of some mechanics that were like breaking line of sight. But then they did changes that didn't really fix it, and we'll get to that. But for now, let's just see at the structure of this fight. You have three phases. Each phase, you get the sense of progression becoming harder and harder. And overall, this boss might look like an S tier boss, but then, because of the way certain mechanics were constructed, like Volcanic Hearts, where you had to get these people out, and the zones were just too big, or maybe you just had too little time to react to them. Well, I have a guildie that believes that you should have more time to deal with that. I personally am a believer that you should have smaller circles, so you can address them a bit easier, or at least you can kind of wing them. But because they're so big and you have to act so fast, you have to have a weak aura almost solve it for you. So you have assigned spots with numbers that come in an Ash map, weak aura, and then finally you have a least weak aura that shows the order of players with Volcanic cards. Now, Blizzard is really against weak auras solving the fight for you, hence private auras, and I agree with them, honestly. But the thing is, with this boss, people found a workaround because it was worth it, because the mechanics were poorly designed. And because of that, these shitty weak auras came. And when you do prog on this boss, it feels like shit. You wanna know how it feels to do reclears on this boss? It feels like shit. Because you keep having to do weak aura setup and setup because they bug because of that and that. Like the hash map weak aura is a fucking nightmare to set up, and it just keeps giving problems. So I wish that was never part of the game, and hopefully in interviews they've already mentioned they don't like it either. Hopefully we'll never see it ever again. But the reality is this boss just got ruined because of that one little detail. And if that wasn't enough, I want to talk about the last mechanic, the last phase, the Big Bang mechanic in last phase. You have 20 zones or just over 20 zones for 20 players. That's pretty hard to nail. That's kind of like Rygalon vibes, but Rygalon had more options and you could actually pre-move into them. But here you can't pre-move into them or you die. You move late, you die. So you have to move just as the Big Bang cast is about to go off, you enter and you come out. And the reality is you assign with the mash map, and even then it's still a little bit of a nightmare. So again, you're going to that shitty week or to solve a poorly designed mechanic. All in all, I wish I could give Echo of Neltharion an S tier rank, but then he has things that will make him F. So I think it's a good compromise to tell him he deserves to be in B tier, just above Forgotten Experiments, because he had some potential. Okay, finally we are down to Sarkareth, okay? The last boss of this raid, and man, it's a great fight. So we start with this very intensive phase 1, and it's just your like heal check and stuff. And let's be honest, it's very mechanically heavy, this boss, but when you get to the end of phase 1, you'll get information of, hey, do you have the heal check for this fight? Like for this phase at least? And hey, did you make this boss to like 67% or whatever, or 68? If the answer is yes to both, then now you have both the damage and the heal checks to do the entire fight. So just doing phase 1 is gonna give you the answers that you need, like for knowing if you can do the entire fight and if you have the numbers to do the entire fight. And that is something that I just love, right? So if I put a certain comp and I put those that comp doing that boss there, and they can do it put the boss, I don't know, on 66% even, and we heal this without anyone dying, then we know, like, okay, now we just need to execute mechanics and this boss die, because there's no DPS check up ahead that we won't be able to make it, right? You have this intermission, which requires some coordination to poop, and so does the second intermission going in and then like coming out. That's really cool. That's actually very cool, because that's the next step up. That's when you find something that you didn't know for your guild, which is how good you really are with coordination, because that is actually hard coordination-wise. But yeah, so it's like phase 3, right? And we have a saying, like in our guild, you get to phase 3, that's when prog starts, because if you get to phase 3, you're still not half prog. That boss is very intensive in phase 3. And all of these barrages and like bombs and ascension and knockbacks, it's just so many mechanics, and it's like so messy, but it's good, and it feels great. Now, if anyone watching this did Sire de Nafrius on Mythic or whatever, back in Castle Nafria, you remember these swirlies in phase 2, right? They were hard to spot, and what Blizzard did was they changed the color from red to bright orange, almost yellowish kind of thing, and that kind of made it better. And this fight does suffer from that. If I'm gonna point like a problem with this fight, is that there's like a lot of clutter, and sometimes things are hard to see because they're always the same color. And I would have loved for things to be easier to spot, because when you have so many chaotic mechanics, at least give us the ability to be able to spot things quickly. And having to kind of look for it while doing like a million things, it's a bit panicky, but it's still great fun. Finally, I wanted to talk about this boss being 7 minutes. If anyone here knows me, you should know that I'm a very fan of long fights. I keep saying, and I'm a madman, I know everyone's gonna disagree with me, but my perfect end expansion fight will be like half an hour, some crazy shit with 16 phases or whatever. But here's the thing. The reality is you can't make a boss long just because you want it to be long. There needs to be a reason, and there needs to be engaging every single phase. And this boss is actually 7 minutes, so away from the 14-minute fight on Razagev. And right now, I thought I probably wouldn't like it a lot, and Blizzard proved me wrong. They proved me that even with 7 minutes, by making this boss extremely intensive mechanically, it's so heavy on mechanics all the time, you can actually make a very good boss and feel like very complete with just 7 minutes, right? So that boss is just phenomenal. And by the way, just so you get an idea how good it feels killing it, if you haven't, well, this is what happened to our comms. Come on guys, push that shit. Let's go! Let's go! Let's go!
Finally. Nice.
Oh, I got bullet well. Two stays, oh my god. I have no fucking edge.
Holy shit, man.
So fucking easy.
So yeah, if you manage to kill that boss, that might happen as well for you, but yeah, it just feels great. There's almost nothing negative about this boss. The boss is just amazing, and between 7-10 minutes, whatever, even if the fights are gonna be like 10 minutes for next, like Frag, for example, for the next raid, is it gonna be 9 minutes, 10 minutes? Even if it's like around that time, I'm sure they can make like a very, very good complete fight. And you don't need to make it 14 minutes like you used to other bosses, because clearly Sarkareth is proof that a short fight can be awesome, and by far the strongest S and easiest S I will give here. If I can... Hello? There. And yeah, that's Sarkareth, and that's the tier list. That's my thoughts on this raid. And I can say that this is looking good. You have 3 bosses that were amazing, and then you have 2 bosses that were really good, some bosses that were somewhat disappointing in certain things, a boss that was a letdown, and a disaster. So the fact that we have more bosses pulling towards the top of the tier list rather than to the bottom, this is a good sign, and I hope that Blizzard keeps going this direction, and it will be very fun to see over the course of Dragonflight how, I don't know, these tier lists that, these silly tier lists that I make with my crazy thoughts, how many fights I will enjoy per raid throughout the entire expansion. So yeah, I can't wait to the next one. If you've been watching all this time, thanks for watching, you're cool as fuck, and yeah, I'm back to Season 3 prep, and I'll be streaming it and whatnot. Yeah, make sure to check it. I think it's gonna be fucking awesome, the new raid, it looks cool. But yeah, for now, I'm out. See ya, take care, bye bye.